I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'd also like to welcome our very special guest here today, Dr Enrico Letta. Dr Letta was, of course, the 55th Prime Minister of the Republic of Italy, finishing his term in early 2014. He's a guest in Australia and here today because the UTS Australia-China Relations Institute brought him out here, and specifically its director, Professor the Honourable Bob Carr. Now, Bob needs, of course, no further introduction from me to this crowd, but I think it'll suffice to say, sincerely, Bob, thank you so much for bringing him here today and for choosing the McKell Institute to host him. Thank you. Now, anyone that's read a newspaper, turned on a television, looked at any kind of social media in the last month or so could not have escaped the problems that are besetting Europe at the moment. Greece is struggling to find a way to service its ballooning debt, now up to 175% of GDP, which sort of puts Australia in perspective. And as Europe grapples between bad case scenarios and worst case scenarios, we're extremely fortunate to have a guest of such international repute as Dr Letta, who has literally sat around these negotiating tables with many of the leaders that are there today to lead us and guide us through these discussions. After Dr Letta has spoken, we're going to give him a chance to have something to eat, and then he'll be joining us for a question and answer session later. So by all means, have some questions ready. Now, during Dr Letta's time as Prime Minister, he had the unenviable task of helping guide Italy's post-GFC recovery. But over that time, he saw Italy record its first quarter of growth in over 3 years. During his time in office, he focused on the basics of cleaning up corruption in the political system and unblocking the civil justice system, which are two necessary preconditions to economic growth. He's become renowned for his modesty and his intelligence, as well as his consensus building. But now, why does this matter to an Australian audience at a domestic think tank in Sydney at a lunch? Well, firstly, the Italian community is, of course, an integral part of Sydney's broader community. It's often held up as one of the success stories of multiculturalism. But frankly, that tends to focus on only one wave of immigration, on the sort of post-war reconstruction phase. But in truth, Italy's ties to Australia go back much, much further. The first wave of Italian immigration occurred during the gold rush of the 1850s. But I'm informed we can go back even further to an Italian on literally the first fleet. We can even go back further to white settlement in Australia. When Captain James Cook landed the Endeavour in Botany Bay, he was accompanied by two men of Italian descent, James Mantra and Antonio Ponto. Almost 250 years later, 200,000 Australians who are Australian citizens, live in Australia, were in fact born in Italy. Over 1 million more Australians claim an ancestry to Italy in some form or another. But more than these obvious cultural ties, our economic and trading markets are inextricably linked. Italy is one of the largest trading partners that Australia has in the European Union, and last year was one of our larger trading partners globally. Our countries have invested well over $7 billion in each other in trade and do almost that same amount of trade every single year. I'd now like to introduce our host for today, Joseph Gratzi, the Managing Partner of PwC's Sydney office. Joseph is one of Sydney's most esteemed and respected businessmen and has helped lead Australian companies in strategic growth program implementation for over a decade with PwC. But among other things, he is also the chair of the Italian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a board member of the European Australian Business Council. I'd like to thank him very much for PwC and PwC firstly for their membership of McKell, but also more specifically for hosting us here today. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Sam, and good day, everybody. Welcome to this luncheon. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of PwC to host this luncheon on behalf of the McKell Institute. I'd like to congratulate Sam and everyone at the McKell Institute for the important work that you do in promoting the cause of reform, of debate, and engaging with the community on initiatives that are going to help this country reach its potential in terms of economic growth and prosperity. As we share a commitment at PwC, we share a need to maintain an engagement with the community to promote growth and promote initiatives that will help this country reach its potential. And one of our hallmark beliefs in the firm is that there is no point being a successful business if we're operating in a failed community. So organisations like the McKell Institute and other research institutes that do spend a lot of intellectual capital in promoting policy are exactly the organisations we'd like to support and help promote in this community. Indeed, it's also a particular privilege in terms of my role as chairman of the Italian Chamber of Commerce to welcome our guest of honour, Dr Enrico Letta. And I just take this opportunity of welcoming the Italian Consul General for Sydney, Sergio Martez, who's here joining us today as well. And Dr Martez, in terms of your support during your time as Consul General for Italy, it's been very much appreciated. I know your term is coming to an end, and we want to sincerely thank you for your support and wish you well in your next endeavours. Please join us in Dr. Dr Letta's address today could not have come at a more critical time. I think we are wondering at the media reports as to the way that the European Union, its legislative framework and its ambitions are being tested by the issues that are resulting from the Greek tension at the moment. I'm looking forward, Dr Letta, in hearing your address, not just in terms of the Greek situation, but more broadly the implications that might have in terms of the EU going forward and the membership and sustainability of the ambitions of the EU members as well. Dr Letta, I'm particularly pleased to recognise that whilst you're a very esteemed leader from the Italian community, and one that does the brand of Italy no end of good in your various activities around the world, I do want to recognise that whilst you were born in Pisa, your father is from the Abruzzi region, which is where my parents were from as well. So I share a very, very special link with you as well. I do hope you've enjoyed your time here in Sydney. It's a real credit, the Honourable Bob Carr, that you've been able to secure Dr Letta's visit to be with us here for the last couple of weeks. And it's my pleasure on behalf of everyone here for if you could join me in welcoming Dr Letta to the stage for his address.
I would like, first of all, to thank Joseph for this very, very nice presentation. Sam Crosby, too, for the invitation here, the McKell Institute, and, of course, PwC. It is, for me, a pleasure to be here, to have this great opportunity to share with you some views, some ideas. I would like also to thank the Consul, General Consul, Sergio Martez. I was here 3 years ago. He was at the beginning of his very good and successful work, and really it will be for him a great challenge to be ambassador now in his next position. So good luck for your future, and I'm sure that you will serve Italy in a perfect way. So thank you. It is a great opportunity for me to be here for many reasons. The first reason, of course, is the fact that we are here far from Italy, far from Europe, geographically far from Europe and from Italy, but we are here in the very moment of the deepest crisis of the European Union, of the euro area integration. And for me, it was here, these 2 weeks that I spent in the UTS in the university, thanks to Bob Carr, and I would like to thank him very much for his generosity, his invitation. For me, it was very, very interesting to be in UTS in this very period. And I repeat, it is very good for me to look at the European crisis from here, from down under. It is a way to go to the fundamental and not to waste time around shades, around nuance, as we always usually do in Europe, in the European political situation. So what are the fundamentals in the European situation today, and why are we in crisis? This is the key point. And I will say very briefly, because I think what is very interesting will be the Q&A session, so I will try just to give you some suggestions, some ideas. The key point, it is the true question, why the United States solved their own financial crisis in 2008 in 6 months, and why we, the Europeans, we didn't. Why we, the Europeans, we are still in the same crisis for the third time, in the third Greek nightmare, without having been able to solve it in these 8 years. This is the key point, the key question, and I will try to answer this question. Because, of course, it is a question we can have many different answers. My answer is the fact that the States, the virus was the same, the subprime crisis, the private debt that became a crisis of public debt, of the banking system, the financial system. The States, they solved the crisis in 6 months. Why? Because of their federal united institutions. They were able in 6 months to inject liquidity in the system, to rescue their banks, to have new laws approved by their Congress, and to solve the problem, to exit from the crisis in 6 months. We, the Europeans, this is the key point, we spent 7 years to decide how to decide. This is the key point. It's not for laugh, it is true. The first part of these 7 years, we spent this first part of the 7 years discussing on how to give or not to give a mandate to the European Central Bank to do the same than the Fed did. And at the end of 6 months, 7 months, finally, Mario Draghi and the ECB had the opportunity and the possibility. He was able to do what the Fed did in the States 6-7 years ago. And this is why in the last 4 or 5 months we had the first positive results. Because of the quantitative easing ECB initiative, that was a big injection of liquidity, 60 billion euros each month for the next 3 years from the ECB initiative. That changed radically the situation of the European financial system and the European situation. We had a different mood, and this different mood changed dramatically in the last weeks because of the Greek crisis. What was the key point of the success of Mario Draghi's initiative on quantitative easing? 2 key points. The first one, lowering the interest rates in all the European countries, not only in Germany and France, but all the European countries, so eliminating the spread. That was the key problem of the European Union, of the euro area, in the first period of the crisis, so 9, 10, 11. The big gap between the interest rates, the Italian, Spanish interest rates, and the German, the French, and the Dutch and the Finnish interest rates. Today, with this big initiative, with big quantitative easing, we eliminated this gap. The second key point was the the big problem of the export in Europe. We are an export economic system, an export-based economic system, and we, the Italians and the Germans, are the leaders in this export driven system. And we had, during all the period of the crisis, because of the very proactive American initiative, a very negative currency rate between the euro and the American dollar. I remember when I was, in the period I was Prime Minister, we had 1.35, 32, 38. That was a disaster for our export. Now we are around 1.10. It is completely different. It's the difference between moon and the sun. And this is because of this quantitative easing initiative. So we have today the two most important macroeconomic conditions. And if you had a third one that is not because of quantitative easing, but it's because of the global market of oil and energy prices, but we have a very low oil price in the world and in Europe too, we have these three very good and very positive macroeconomic conditions. So we are ready to grasp recovery because of this ECB initiative. We have the big risk of the Greek crisis wasting everything. This is the key point. And this is why I'm so concerned, and we are also concerned about Greece and about the solution, the need to find a solution for the Greek crisis. Because if not, the European Union and the Euro area will remain in this permanent crisis of trust, first of all, but also of performances. Because the key point of the crisis was the fact that the states solved the crisis. They were out. We didn't. And we entered a first part of the crisis with a big impact in terms of in the financial system, as you all know very well, in the beginning, 8, 9, 10. Then the second impact, the second wave was on the real economy system, so a big loss of growth. Third impact, as a third wave, was on the social impact of the crisis, so the rise of the unemployment, first of all the youth unemployment in the southern countries. That is the key point and the crucial point, the true nightmare of our societies. When you have 40% of youth unemployment in Italy, 50% youth unemployment in Spain and Portugal, 60% youth unemployment in Greece, and you have these figures for 2, 3, 4, 5 years in a row, you are building a system with lost generations. And if you build a system with lost generations, you miss the great opportunity to have hope for the future. This is the key point, and this is why the third wave was for the social impact. And of course, if you have financial crisis, real economic crisis, then the social impact crisis, it is natural that the fourth wave is on politics, on the political system. This is why today, not immediately, because it was not in 8, 9, 10, it is now, 14, 13, 15. In these final years, in the last years, we had the impact of the tsunami on our costs, and this impact, it is today on the political system. It is an impact based on the rise of anti-establishment parties, anti-Euro parties, anti-European Union parties, parties without a traditional approach, parties with, they are not left and right. It is difficult to say left and right. It is something of completely new. But the key point is that all the big European countries, but Germany, we were used to have a two-party system with two big parties, altogether around 80% of the votes, 70% of the votes, like it is in Australia or in the States too. And today, the rise of all these new anti-establishment parties is creating a system in which we have the two main parties all together in some countries like Spain, like Italy, like France, no more than 50% of the votes. So the rest of the system is as fragmented and based on new political movement with fragmentation and without the possibility to create alliances and stable governments. This is what happened in Greece. The two main parties, the two dominating parties, were reduced to be altogether 40%. PASOK and Neo Democratia. And a new party raised, and this new party, the party of Mr. Tsipras, is the one who won the referendum. The big fear is that the same could happen in Spain next November, December, for the next national elections there, with these new two parties, Podemos and Ciudadanos. These two parties are parties with, in the last elections, regional elections, around, both together around 30-40% of the votes. And the two traditional parties of the Spanish transition, Partido Popular, Socialistas, today are no more than jointly 45-50% of the votes. So I can say the same for France, I can say the same for other countries. So the key point is that today the outcome of the crisis is a political earthquake in the European countries, in the European Parliament too, where the situation is very fragmented. And the fifth consequence is the mood of the public opinion in Europe. That is a mood in which the anti-Euro and anti-European integration approach is rising and overtaking the traditional pro-European mood. So this is these 7-8 years of European history. In these years, we are today with these kind of outcomes that are very difficult to manage with. This is why the key point today is, and this is my conclusion in this first part of our meeting, we need not to waste these great, very important macroeconomic conditions to grasp recovery. If we waste these conditions and these opportunities, it will be very difficult, almost impossible, to avoid the rise of populism in Europe and to avoid a situation in which it will be very difficult to have national and European institutions in the hands of governments and of politicians with a good aim to find positive and common solutions. If not, it will be very easy to lose all the idea of the European integration that is, in my view, the big dream of our future. And when I say the big dream, I know very well that today this dream is very weak in our population, in our public opinion. But when I say dream, and I end up here, I say dream because from this part of the world, maybe it is more comprehensible what I would like to say. We are entering a century which is the Asian century, a century in which countries which were completely marginalized in the 20th century are today key players, and there will be more and more key players in the world. And it's not just China and India. It is also Korea, it is Indonesia, it is the rest of the ASEAN countries. It is a world in which Asia is becoming more and more central and important. In this world, European countries, we were the center of the world in the last century. We are no more the center of the world. We are still very attractive with a big soft power, culturally attractive. But the key point is, what will be the future of the European countries in this century? What will be our future if we stay alone? What will be our future if we waste the opportunity to be united? And the world of tomorrow, if I look at the year in the world in the year 2040, 2035, it will be a world in which, at the table where the rules will be decided, the United States will be there, China will be there, other Asian countries will be there, and we, the Europeans, we will be there only if we will be united. If we will be separated, fragmented, we will be just rule takers of rules settled by others, not by us with others. And we, I would say, are proud to say that we as Europeans, we bring values in the world discussion, in the world global governance discussion, that are decisive for the future of the world in terms of climate change, environment, workers' rights, human rights values, trade values, and I can continue, anti-corruption values, and so on and so forth. We think that we, the Europeans, we can play a role, but only if we are united. If not, it will be probably a word in 30 or 40 years' time, in the next 40 years, 30 years, without a strong European presence at these tables, and we will be among the rule takers. This is today a big challenge for us. It is not easy. I know very well it's not easy. But this is why I think we have to solve Grexit, and we have to avoid Grexit, because Grexit will be, in my view, the first step of the European decline. After this third crisis, a Grexit will be a very, very difficult moment in which the markets will start to think who's next, who will be the next. And we can avoid Grexit, in my view. It is possible because the result of Sunday's referendum gave a big strength to Prime Minister Tsipras. I wasn't happy of the result. But now, after the decision to fire Mr. Varoufakis, I think that the situation is much better, because it's the situation, in my view, to a country, to a Prime Minister Tsipras, with the right idea to find an agreement, and it was absolutely clear that Varoufakis was an obstacle to any possibility to find agreements. Now we have the next 72 hours. This week will be decisive. I think there are the conditions to find the final agreement, and finding this final agreement, we will be out of the Grexit nightmare. But this week will be really decisive, and this is why, from here, my guess and my hope is that the goodwill will prevail, and I'm sure that goodwill will prevail. Thank you.
So now's the part where you all get to your opportunity to ask various questions. I figured, to kick it off, largely because I'm sitting up here, I'll go first. I was interested in one of the very last points that you finished up on about the rise of China, the rise of Asia, and I guess the corresponding decline of Europe. How does that impact How does that impact world bodies like the G8, like the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, bodies that have traditionally been very Eurocentric. What's the future for those bodies in this new world order?
You raised the key point, and I think this afternoon with Bob Carr at UTS, this topic about the global governance will be one of the key topics of our conversation. Both together, Europe and the United States, we were in 95 the 45% of world economy. Europe and the United States together, in 45, we were in 95, we were the 45% of world economy. In the same year, the BRICS, they were 17% of the world economy. Next year, 2016, the BRICS, they will overtake US and Europe together. So they will be 33, the BRICS, and we, Europe and the States together, we will be 32. So in 20 years, we had, I think, the most unpredictable and huge overtake in the economic history. And this overtake was not because we, Europeans and the Americans, we lost richness, we lost power, but because they grew up in 20 years in a very fast way. So this is the key point. The relationship between this change and the burden sharing of the political responsibility. Because this huge change, 45 versus 17, and today 33 versus 32, this kind of change doesn't mean that there is a consequent ability to take responsibility from this part of the world. Because when you have a crisis, you always ask what the Americans will do, what the Europeans will do. When you have a crisis or when you have a discussion on climate change, on the key point is what will be the responsibility that Americans and Europeans will take. But first of all, on security crisis, when you have a big crisis in the world, is always asking the Americans or the Europeans to take their own responsibility. The key point is that we built the G20, and the G20, in my view, was a great achievement in 2007, 8, 9, 10, because it was the first step in building a global governance that is necessary. But frankly speaking, the last performances of the G20 weren't, I would say, consequent. The sequence was not a sequence, a raising sequence. I would say it was a decreasing sequence in terms of importance. Los Cabos, St. Petersburg, even Brisbane. And I fear that the Turkish presidency this year of the G20 will not deliver a great G20 meeting. So the big risk is that we found the right place, but we didn't deliver enough. And we are still now looking for a place where we can discuss and decide at global level, because the G7 is just a meeting between Europeans and Americans, yes, and Japan, but it is a very focused meeting. The UN Security Council has a big problem of legitimacy, and the United Nations are, in my view, living in very dire straits. The Syrian situation we had a crisis in Syria in which the UN didn't play any role at all. We were together with Bob in the G20 in St. Petersburg when Ban Ki-moon and Lakhdar Brahimi, frankly speaking, the UN role was very poor. Not because of their performance, but because it is not time for big multilateral institutions. And this is a big problem. So my final point is that I fear that this change in the world level of influence in the economic world, they don't have enough outcome in the burden sharing in terms of responsibilities. So we, European, Americans, we are less important, but we are still those with the responsibility to solve the big solution, the big crisis in the world. And that brings a world in which it is very difficult to find a way to solve the crisis. And we are in permanent crisis. So maybe the key point is that we have to enter in a mood in which crises are the normality of the world, not the exception of the world. That is not easy to do, and it's not easy to learn.
Questions? Yep, so Jody, we've got one over here.
Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti in Australia. A few questions, I suppose, and observations. Recently, I was reading an article out of Europe, which basically, I think it was a senior finance minister out of one of the Scandinavian countries, who basically said that we've spent 6 months talking about Greece and a Greece exit, the equivalent of President Obama talking about the state of Tennessee for 6 months. So basically, we've spent enough time on talking about Greece and its problems. So, two-part question. Firstly, is the concern about a Greece exit economic, or is the major concern geopolitical, with Putin in particular? Because the argument being there's a lot of other issues, rather than a country of 8 million people and a small one at that, as opposed to the potential for Greece to become close to Putin and obviously Russia seeking to assert itself in Europe. So question in and around that, I suppose, is how much more time is Europe, and also, as you raise, a country like Germany and their constituency going to tolerate talking about Greece when there's all these other issues to consider?
Very good point. Tennessee, yes, Tennessee is Greece. But Europe has not the same institution than the United States they have. Because if Tennessee failed, you don't read any line, any headline in any Australian newspapers. On failure of Greece, you have the top headlines. Why? Because the states, they have the federal institutions able to solve and to immediately solve the problem. We in Europe, we didn't have, we are starting to have some of these institutions because we have today the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. That is a big improvement we decided in 2012. But the problem is still there because of the difficulty to find a solution. And this difficulty is, in my view, linked to the absence or the weakness of the European institutions. If Tennessee fails, it is necessary to go up to solve the problem, not to ask for Alabama or Montana to solve the problem of Tennessee. You need to go up. And in Europe, it was very difficult to go up. And when you ask the Spanish people or the Portuguese or the Germans or the Italians, you solve the problem of the Greeks, it is quite impossible to do it. Because an Italian citizen will start to say, hey, wait a minute, we had a very tough pension reform. We get a retirement age at 67. What is their retirement age? So you need to go up. solidarity frameworks need to have some up institution to solve this problem. So the main problem is and was the weakness of the European institutions, and this is the key point. Without giving power to the European institutions, it is impossible to solve crises like the one we had in Greece. This is my first point and maybe my key point. And of course, it is not only like that. You raised a very good point about the geopolitical implications. This crisis today is worse than the two crises we had before with Greece in 9 and 12 because of Ukraine and Russia. And Russia is there. And Greece, the Greek government joked with this possible alternative. I think it was a crazy joke, a suicide, because Russia is not an alternative. But the American, the US fear on this situation is also because of Russian influence there. This is why I think today is another reason to solve the problem without wasting time and to find an agreement. You know, the Greek debt, the total amount of the Greek debt is 328 billion euros. 327 billion euros. Last week, Monday, we had the first day in which the markets, they fear Grexit. In one day, they lost 250 billion euros. So a similar amount of the total Greek debt. This is the demonstration that the problem is not the amount of money. The problem is all the implication, consequences, influence, psychological, collective influence of this topic. Because the figures are so small and it's not impossible to solve the problem and to solve these kind of figures, but the implications are enormous and it is not a laboratory. It is like Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers failure made a lot of and created a lot of consequences that were maybe unpredictable at the beginning. And this is the same. The Greek problem is a very small issue if you are in a laboratory. But you are in a collective world with public opinion, Twitters, and so on and so forth. Varoufakis' number of followers in 5 months raised from 1,000. He had 1,000 followers when he became Minister of Finance. Today he has, if I'm not wrong, but you can easily check, 540,000 followers in 5 months. And his prime minister had no more than 90,000 followers. So becoming a global icon of this. So this is the global communication and the global public opinion is changing the way in which also you have to run economic and financial issues. It's very delicate. The consequences are unpredictable. You can be very, very worried.
We'll go. Oh, can we go to down the front? Sorry, and then we'll come back.
It's Bruce Cooper here from Clayton Utz. I apologise for not having an Italian-sounding surname. I know I'm in the minority here today. You mentioned earlier the increasing political fragmentation in Europe. That was one of the central pieces of your discussion. And we know that political fragmentation doesn't lend itself for longer-term economic decision-making on a reasonable platform. Do you see the current crisis as perhaps lending itself to a healthy dose of economic realism in Europe, which might change the way in which the Europeans look at their political processes, and where might that go to? Because it certainly probably won't go back to a two-party system, but it might go to another extreme. Is that an issue for you?
Maybe. It is a little bit unpredictable, the future on this topic. But what I know is the fact that the crisis created some new divides. One of them, it is a mix between social crisis, financial crisis, and the role of the internet in our lives and in the political system. If you put together all these different topics, you have this the outcome today is an outcome in which in Europe, and I think it is really different here, if I'm not wrong, but in Europe today, the first divide, the most important divide in the political debate is the divide between the establishment and the people. Today is the key point. More than left and right, more than geographical issues, it is people against the establishment. If you are part of the establishment, you have an immediate automatical lack of credibility. And the Greek referendum is exactly the demonstration of the influence of this kind of divide. And it's not just Greece. In Italy, we had, in the election before I became Prime Minister in 2013, a big political crisis because of the rise suddenly of a new party, the Five Star Movement, being exactly a party with this topic. The big flag of this party was people against the establishment. Any kind of establishment. Students against professor, and so on and so forth. And this is the typical topic of the internet role. You know, internet has a big influence in changing the role of authority. In the past, or before internet, or before the big data, the authority was immediately consequence or the outcome of the authority. The big link was with the monopoly of the information. You had authority because you had the monopoly of the information. You were minister, you spoke as minister, and the others, they were obliged to trust in what you were saying because you had the monopoly of the information. You were professor in a university. Think at what is happening today. You are a minister, you are there speaking, you are saying something, but the member of parliament or the others, they can immediately check what you are saying. They are not, you don't have the monopoly of the information. It is the same in university. A professor is there, is saying something. If I say the Greek public debt is 500 billion euros, there's a student saying immediately, sorry, excuse me, professor, but here in my laptop I check and it is 325. What are you saying? And your authoritativeness immediately collapsed. So there's a big new issue, that is the issue that we are experiencing in European politics. That is the issue people establishment. And this issue, in my view, is the crucial one. This is why it is so unpredictable, the future of the European political issue. You know, in Spain, for instance, you have this very strange situation in which you have the two main parties, the two traditional parties, the Partido Popular, Aznar, and Rajoy, and Socialist Party, González and Zapatero. They are both decreasing, and you have two new parties, one center-right and one left. So exactly where the socialists and the popular are, but the cleavage is new, old. People, establishment. No one of the new party leaders were in politics before. No one. And this is like the five-star movement in Italy. To be elected in these parties, it is necessary to be completely out of politics. Out of politics. So the cleavage, new, old, is the other, I would say, side of the moon in terms of people establishment. I could continue on this topic, but I stop immediately because in my view, is one of the most important, most interesting topics in terms of collective discussion we are having in Europe today, but is a crucial one. And of course, in these topics, when you put youth unemployment at 50%, is immediately burning.
Yeah, we'll go to the gentleman in the middle, and then we might have time for one other question as well.
Thanks, Dr. Letta. My name's Karan Anand from Deloitte. Thanks for that great talk. It was some great context on the European crisis that's happening now. If I could switch your attention onto more social issues, one of the challenges Australia's been facing as a country over a number of years now is the arrival of asylum seekers and refugees on boat, and I think it's an issue that Italy's been grappling for a number of years as well. So I'm wondering if you could share a point of view on the Italian experience in that, to see if there's anything we can learn here in Australia.
How much time I have?
We've got about 4 minutes.
No, it's one of my favorite issues because it was maybe the most, for me, the most challenging issue in my period of Prime Minister, because we had the Libyan crisis, the Syrian crisis, and around the Mediterranean, million of refugees. Syria, for instance, moved 11 million people from Syria around the Mediterranean. I visited the Lebanon refugees camp. Lebanon is a country of 4 million people, and they were obliged, I would say, to welcome 1.5 million Syrian people. Can you imagine what does it mean for a country of 4 million people to welcome 1.5 million? So the situation, I think, is very difficult today. Is one of the other issues creating populism in Europe, because there is no European effective answer, reaction. The solidarity in Europe is there just 1 week or 2 weeks after a disaster in the Mediterranean. Then you have some solidarity mood when the images of the coffin are there. Then 2-3 weeks later, this solidarity switch into doors closed. So I think the key point is there is a point linked to the fact that we didn't have in these 20 years a political true political engagement in helping North Africa and Africa. And now we are paying the bill. We are paying the bill. North Africa, Africa is still there with very poor performances, big crisis, Nigeria, the situation in Eritrea, Somaliland, Libya, South Sudan. And we didn't pay, we didn't be engaged there, and now we are paying the bill. So the only key point is to have a new African policy from the European side, Second, to have new policies on migrations. In my view, it is necessary to have two different policies. One for migrations for economic reasons, and there you have to select. You have to put quotas and to be very tough. On the refugees side, you have to apply human rights. You can't close doors for refugees coming from Eritrea, from Libya, from Syria, from civil wars or from religious persecutions. It is, in my view, against our more strong values. So it is necessary to have European leaderships able to talk to the European people and to say it is not an invasion, first of all, because the figures are saying it is not an invasion. We are not like Lebanon. We now, for instance, the topic is how to redistribute 40,000 refugees in a European Union which has 500 million inhabitants. So it's not so impossible. Each country has to have 1,000, 2,000 people, 3,000 people. It's not so impossible. But the perception there is very, in Italy, for instance, we have polls are demonstrating that people are showing that people are convinced that the migration is bringing a 20% of migrants in the Italian population. We think that the average of migrants is 20% of the Italian population. In reality, legal and illegal is not more than 7% of the Italian population. But the perception of the people is 20%, and the gap between 20% and 7% is 10 million people. It's enormous. How can you deal with an issue when the perception and the reality, they have such a big gap? So this is why we need political leaderships able to engage this topic and not to avoid to put their face close to this topic. I'm very sad for the situation in Europe today, because we think that to avoid to talk about this topic, we can avoid to lose votes. It is exactly the opposite. All the Le Pen, the Lega Nord, and the other parties, they are raising exactly because we didn't manage an efficient policy on migrations.
I'm sorry, I know we said we'd have time for one more, but we are flat out of time. Can I welcome up to the stage the chairman of the McKell Institute, John Watkins, to do the vote of thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure to thank Dr. Letta. You can see why Dr. Letta was so successful in the complexity of European politics and Italian politics in particular. Why he was called upon in April 2013 to form that government in Italy. Clearly a man of vast experience with Europe, a person of great integrity and clear thinking and humility and humanity. And his comments on asylum seekers, I think, were very refreshing for many of us here. He also strikes me as a man of great calmness. And the longer I'm out of politics, the more I respect calmness in it. And when he said, and I thought it significant, that perhaps we're entering a time where crisis is the new normality of, that's fear-filling. But you need people like the good doctor who has that calmness. I know he's out of practical politics now, but I hope he hasn't gone away for too long, because surely Italy and Europe needs men of the calibre of Dr. Letta. So thank you very much, Dr. Letta, for your time today, and let's thank the good doctor. I'd also like to thank PwC for their hospitality, Joe. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to have us here and for welcoming Dr. Letta as well. Most of you know McKell. We try to make a difference in sponsoring creative, thoughtful commentary in our community about a whole range of issues, most recently last week, about childcare. I think they are beneficial excursions into public debate, and we'll continue to do that. We thank you if you're a member of McKell. Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming today. If you're not a member of McKell, we'd like your support. We'd encourage you to join us. Consul, thank you for your time today. Honourable Bob Carr, it's always a pleasure to be with Bob and to see Bob. Thanks for arranging this, Bob. Folks, thanks for your time today, and again, thanks for PwC. Appreciate it.